Solange Moujin joins me on the set to take a closer look at what the papers are saying today. Hi, Solange.
Hi,
Let's start in Portugal, where the Prime Minister won a strong victory in the parliamentary election there Sunday.
He did indeed, but he didn't win an absolute majority. And the Portuguese paper, O Jornal, says that the win of 36% of the seats is a better score than in 2015, but that he is going to have to mix and match coalitions with different parties, and that is still necessary. And that this time the parliament is much more, quote unquote, fragmented. Now, O Público also says that this strong win is neither, quote, a revolution nor a complete continuation of the past. The paper says they're pleased that the country has lifted itself up from its economic crisis, but there are still many things to worry about, notably the rise of the far right in the entry of the far right in these elections, as well as abstention numbers, which rose this time around.
You've been taking a look at the Brexit negotiations. Boris Johnson presented his latest Brexit proposal to the French President, Emmanuel Macron, in a phone conversation on Sunday. At least that's what the presidential palace is saying.
Yeah, and according to the British paper, the Daily Express, the phone conversation went down a little bit like this. Quote, PM warns Macron, don't think we won't quit. The paper says that Johnson made it clear that it was, quote, the final chance to find a deal. For the paper, Brussels is playing a very dangerous game of chicken. As they say, the EU chief's negotiator is, quote, piling on the pressure, or sitting there completely unfazed by Johnson's proposal. That's the take of Ben Jennings at The Guardian. In his cartoon, you have Barnier sitting there as a Pinocchio Johnson sticks out his nose, knocks over the Union Jack, which is supposed to be, I guess, an olive branch.
Now, The Guardian, more left-leaning, actually paints that conversation a bit differently.
Yeah, they do. They say that Macron said, like other EU leaders, that Johnson has until the end of the week to revise his Brexit plans, a sort of deadline of sorts that they say increases the chances of negotiations imploding. And in an editorial, they say 10 Downing Street is actually going about this in the wrong way. That, quote, Europe isn't obsessed about obstructing Brexit as some British Eurosceptics feel, that Europe has essentially begun to move on, that there's been an ideological shift within many countries regarding the far right and regarding populism, and that while there are still structural and cultural problems and tensions, Europe is, quote, showing formidable resistance, and that the relevance of UK politics to the continent is fading away.
Moving away from Brexit now, but staying in London, where protesters are descending on Westminster in what's meant to be 2 weeks of environmental activism under the banner of the Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, and London isn't alone in that. There are some 50 cities around the globe that are going to be disrupted, that are being disrupted by environmental activists that belong to the Extinction Rebellion. The Telegraph maps out the roadblocks and says that such a widespread action may garner support for a time, but that commuters' patience may wear thin over the 2 weeks. Now, the French papers are also covering the movement. Libération calls the Extinction Rebellion, quote, fertile disobedience, and they argue that it's a sort of test in France, that so far such widespread roadblocks by hundreds, possibly thousands of environmental activists haven't happened under this banner in France, and if they work, this sort of disruptive but non-violent activism could actually be quite effective.
Now, staying in France, there was another large protest this past weekend against medically assisted procreation for lesbian couples and single moms.
Yeah, and there's much discussion in the French press about whether or not that protest was a success. For the conservative paper Le Figaro, the turnout was a sign of success. An independent group said some 74,000 protesters came out. The police said 40,000. The organizers said 600,000. But regardless of the blown up numbers or the real numbers either, Le Parisien reminds us that those numbers are a far cry from the turnout in 2013 over the same thing. This time, L'Humanité tells us, the left-leaning paper, they say that there were few politicians that were out in front at such protests, and that parliamentarians are looking instead at the polls that show that some 68% of French people believe all women should be able to get medical help to get pregnant if they need to.
Now, the foreign press is also analyzing why this issue creates so much tension here in France.
Yeah, The Atlantic has a great article that explains that France, despite having lots of sort of baby-friendly legislation like tax breaks for families, it has some of the most restrictive laws on fertility treatment. And the American side argues that the debate highlights many paradoxes of what it is to be in modern French society, be it Catholic heritage mixed with staunch belief in secularism, and it even goes as far as immigration, this concept of filiation of what French heritage you come from.
Let's wrap up now. Here in France, still we're talking about things that are French, and there are perhaps few things here in France that are as French as that kiss on both cheeks, la bise.
Yeah, and the academic website, The Conversation, has a fun article about la bise and all of the sort of myths that come with it. And the first one is that it isn't only French, that it dates back to antiquity, and that it is still done from southern Europe to Russia. And they also have maps that show the number of kisses per region. Also, depending on your generation, some people do more. And they even say that even in some regions of France, it's not called the bise. For example, in Alsace, people say it's giving one another a schmutz.
Thank you, Solange. Solange Mougin with that look at the papers today. Don't forget, you can always take a closer look at that on our website. The address is france24.com.